Good evening, welcome to the show. I'm Sharri Markson. Here's what's coming up. Heartless men rip down posters of the Israeli hostages held captive by Hamas in Gaza. The horrifying scenes unfolding at Bondi Beach this afternoon. This explosion in anti-Semitism is undeniable, but when the Prime Minister was asked about it today, he then immediately spoke about Islamophobia. Israeli politician Sharon Haskell will join me later, and so will Arab-Israeli activist Yoseph Haddad. The Treasurer and Anthony Albanese outlined their vision to use renewable energy to get inflation under control. But not all are thrilled by the plan. Jason Morrison, Bronwyn Bishop and Danica DiGiorgio will break down this green economy approach. And the cook behind the deadly mushroom lunch that killed 3 was sensationally arrested this morning by Victorian police. A top criminologist will take us through today's events. Overnight, 500 Palestinians with dual citizenships or other nationalities have left through Egypt's Rafah crossing. This includes 23 of the 88 Australian citizens, residents or relatives who've been living in or visiting Gaza. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has made clear he wants these 88 people to come to Australia. But there are grave concerns that he will bring them straight into our country without proper security checks. What are their political affiliations? Do they share our Australian values and ideals? Or are they bringing right to our shores a deep hatred for Jews that they may act upon? You have to ask, if Gaza is hell on earth like everyone claims, if it's a prison, why have these people chosen to live or visit there? Albanese, a lifelong pro-Palestinian activist, hasn't once mentioned security concerns about bringing people who may have been on the front line right into Australia. He hasn't once mentioned a word about what the government will be doing to make sure they haven't been involved in the barbaric terror attacks on Israel. Opposition leader Peter Dutton is very concerned about this security risk, as he told Ray Hadley last week.
Do you have any grave concerns about the possibility or safety risk of people being repatriated from Gaza, Palestinians, who may be sympathetic to Hamas and bringing them here, and their possible associations? I mean, it appears to me that many people who may have been here and born here have an undying allegiance to that part of the world that they can't separate from their Australian citizenship. And I hate to think that all of a sudden at some time down the track we start to repatriate people from that part of the world because of the damage that's going to be caused, that they come here and bring with them ill will.
So the government would need to be very wary about bringing people out of a very difficult war-torn environment at the moment. Ultimately, the Prime Minister's got to act in our country's best interests, and I don't believe it's in our country's best interests to be increasing that intake at the moment without certainty around who individuals are and the fact that they're going to, be perfect Australian citizens or as best as we can hope for. So I think that the circumstances and the conditions at the moment are precarious, and I'd be surprised if the government's considering that, to answer your question.
So you heard there Peter Dutton say he'd be surprised if the government was considering this. Well, the government is considering this. It's doing it. We asked Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill if security checks are being done or have been done on these people leaving Gaza before they land in Australia. Her office told us just this evening, we are closely vetting the status of Australians and family members exiting Gaza. Australia also has strong laws aimed at discouraging the movement of Australians who pose security concerns, including passport cancellations. No details, though, on whether they will be put in a camp, a refugee camp, a processing detention facility while these security checks are underway. No detail about how long this will take. This is a gravely serious issue. ASIO is already concerned about the risk to the Jewish community, and we've seen people feel comfortable enough to openly say that Jews should be gassed and killed in Australia, and police didn't lift a finger at the time. And now Albanese wants to bring people, some of whom could be coming straight from the front line, into the country. We have to pray that our security agencies will muscle up to him and say that these checks need to be done to ensure none of them have been involved with Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or any other terror group. There were rigorous security checks before anyone was brought into the country during the war on ISIS in Syria and Iraq. As you know, the relatives of ISIS fighters, the so-called ISIS brides, spent years in detention camps while security agencies assessed their risk. So we need to know that the same will be done now. Hamas barbarians didn't care if their targets were babies, the elderly, pregnant women, and we have to ensure this terrorism never comes into Australia. We need to protect our children in Jewish schools. Anti-Semitism is already at unprecedented levels. Now, the calls today for a ceasefire from Israel are growing. And even Joe Biden today seemed to say that Israel should take a pause in its fighting. They were bizarre comments from the US president, who until now has been extremely strong and supportive of Israel. It's unclear if he was confused or muddled in that moment, or if he knew what he was saying. But what is clear is that anti-Semitism has reached fever pitch in the United States, just like it has here in Australia. Look at these images of Jewish students, trying to escape a Harvard anti-Israel protest. Harvard University. Former Harvard President Larry Summers has already blasted the Ivy League school and its leadership, saying we're in a time of moral crisis. I mean, these are terrifying pictures to be looking at. And this all comes after Jewish students in New York had to lock themselves in a library to escape an angry mob of pro-Palestinian protesters. And just today in Bondi Beach, there was a beautiful tribute to those being held hostage by Hamas, and men started ripping the posters of the Jews down. You can see in the clip I'm about to show you a pregnant woman arguing with them not to take down the posters. She says, "This is my family." Have a look.
The hostages aren't here, mate. They're not here. So why are we bringing them on? They're not your family.
What are you here for?
Because we don't need to bring this violence here. Why?
Yeah, but you are. You are. You're bringing your posters and your flags and everything.
You can see the men are holding scrunched up pictures of the hostages. Bondi Beach just today. With scenes like this all over the world, the FBI Director Christopher Wray came out and warned that the risk of terror is now heightened. He said the threat level has been raised. He made these comments at the Senate Committee on Homeland Security this week.
The reality is that the terrorism threat has been elevated throughout 2023, but the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole nother level.
He said he couldn't discount the possibility that Hamas or another foreign terror organisation wouldn't exploit the current conflict to conduct attacks on US soil. And yet, Kamala Harris posted this on her social media today. She wrote, "Taking on hate is a national priority. Today, the President of the United States and I are announcing the country's first national strategy to counter, wait for it, not anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. This action is the latest step forward in our work to combat a surge of hate in America."
And so today, I am proud to announce the Biden-Harris administration will develop our nation's first national strategy to counter Islamophobia.
No one is saying Islamophobia isn't a problem and shouldn't be tackled. Of course, it's important. But right now, it's undeniable that the biggest problem globally we're witnessing is anti-Semitism. That's why the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, publicly issued his warning. But not according to the hapless Kamala Harris. It reminds me of when the White House Press Secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, was asked also about anti-Semitism and turned it into a question about Islamophobia.
Level of concern right now about the potential rise of anti-Semitism in light of everything that's going on in Israel?
So a couple of things. We have not seen any credible threats. I know there's been always questions about credible threats, and so just want to make sure that that's out there. But look, Muslim and those perceived to be Muslim have endured a disproportionate number of hate-fueled attacks.
Now, interestingly, Anthony Albanese took this same approach today. He turned a question about anti-Semitism into an answer about Islamophobia. Have a look.
We are concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism, which has been on the rise, and we provided money for security in Jewish schools and Jewish institutions, synagogues, but we've also provided money for the Islamic community and the Palestinian community. There are women very regularly who get abused, who get vilified because they're wearing a hijab in this country as well. And these forms of hatred are completely unacceptable.
You get the sense that our leaders really aren't doing enough to protect the Jewish community, that they aren't taking this terrifying, unprecedented rise in hatred towards Jews seriously enough. By contrast, Hillary Clinton has been very strong in her support of Israel, saying that a ceasefire would only strengthen Hamas.
People who are calling for a ceasefire now do not understand Hamas. That is not possible. It would be such a gift to Hamas because they would spend whatever time there was a ceasefire in effect rebuilding their armaments, creating stronger positions to be able to fend off an eventual assault by the Israelis.
She's right, of course, as we've been speaking about this week. You wouldn't have a ceasefire with the Nazis or with ISIS, so why would you with Hamas, who are every bit as evil? The way Hamas slaughtered innocent babies and young people clearly shows it shouldn't be given the opportunity to regroup. A senior Hamas official, Ghazi Hamad, made clear that their aim is the total annihilation of Israel in an interview with a television station in Lebanon just a few days ago.
دولة لا مقام لها على أرضنا، إحنا الدولة لابد أن نزيلها، لأنه بالفعل هي تعتبر كارثة أمنية وعسكرية وسياسية للأمة العربية والإسلامية، يجب أن تنتهي. لذلك احنا لا نخجل من نقول ذلك بكل قوه انه إسرائيل لازم نأدبها وحنأدبها مره ثانيه وثالثه، ومش هذا حتكون طوفان الاقصى اول مره، لا حتكون ثانيه وثالثه ورابعه، لانه احنا لدينا اصرار ولدينا قرار ولدينا امكانيات ان نقاتل نعم. ونحارب، لكن كما قلت لك بدنا ندفع ثمن. نعم احنا مستعدين، معلش بدي اقول لك بشكل واضح، احنا اسمنا شعب الشهداء وبنفخر ان نقدم شهداء، احنا لا نريد ان نمس لا بالمدنيين ولا ان نلحق الاذى بهم، لكن اوقات لانه في تعقيدات في الميدان صارت في منطقة موجودة وكان هناك في احتفال وكان في سكان وفي منطقة واسعة ليست سهلة على امتداد تقريبا 40 كيلومتر. يجب أن ننتهي.
أن ينتهي وين؟
بس
بقطاع غزة؟
ينتهي إلى لا بتكلم عنه كل الأراضي الفلسطينية.
كل الأراضي الفلسطينية يعني زوال إسرائيل؟
طبعا. وجود إسرائيل غير منطقي. وجود إسرائيل هو اللي بخلق كل هذه الآلام والعذابات والدموع والدماء، هي إسرائيل مش احنا ضحيه الاحتلال، نقطه واخر السطر. لذلك ما حدا يلومنا، احنا شو اللي بنعمله في 7 اكتوبر، في 10 اكتوبر، في مليون اكتوبر، احنا اللي بنعمل مبرر. It is justified، مبرره.
So that Hamas leader making clear he wants the annihilation of all of Israel and that Hamas would repeat again and again the atrocities, the slaughter of October 7. But Albanese still wants a ceasefire, a point he made once again today.
Well, we said a week ago that there was a need for a pause for humanitarian concerns. And that remains our position.
You cannot have a ceasefire with Hamas. You can't have peace with Hamas. They don't want peace. They want to continue to commit terror attacks against Jews every single day until Israel is destroyed, as that Hamas leader, Ghazi Hamad, made abundantly clear. How can you have a ceasefire with a terror group? You can't. UK's Labour leader, Keir Starmer, by the way, also agrees that there can't be a ceasefire with Hamas. He says that this would only embolden them.
because a ceasefire always freezes any conflict in the state where it currently lies. And as we speak, that would leave Hamas with the infrastructure and the capability to carry out the sort of attack we saw on October the 7th.
So, Hillary Clinton and British Labour are both at odds with Albanese and Penny Wong. Now, we've seen that proportionality has been quite a big theme in this war, but a Victorian Labor politician, Philip Dalidakis, has exposed the hypocrisy of Greens and other politicians who didn't seem to care about the number of Syrian lives lost in the battle against ISIS or the number of those killed in Afghanistan or civilians in Yemen, but suddenly they're obsessed with casualties in Israel's war on terror.
If you look at Adam Bandt, he's spoken twice about Yemen since he's been in Parliament. And of course, the conflict in Yemen started in 2014, and he's been a Member of Parliament since 2010. But he's spoken about Israel 14 times. Senator Steele John, who is the spokesperson for Foreign Affairs, has spoken about Israel 6 times in Parliament. He's spoken about Yemen 0 times. And of course, when it comes to one of our own senators here in Victoria, the outgoing retiring Senator Janet Rice, she's spoken about Israel 12 times, but she's spoken about 500,000 deaths in Yemen exactly 0 times. What you can see is a very clear bias, almost anti-Semitism from the Greens party.
It doesn't seem to me that Labor and the Greens care as much about civilian casualties in any other region of the world, but now they demand that terrorists be defeated without a single loss of life, because it's Israel. And perhaps they think that Israel's right to exist as a homeland of the Jewish people isn't a worthy cause for war. Netanyahu wrote in the Wall Street Journal this week that just as the United States wouldn't have agreed to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after 9/11, he won't agree to one after October 7. He said it would be a surrender to terror. He wrote, as long as the international community blames Israel for Hamas's use of Palestinian human shields, Hamas will continue to employ this tool of terror. He wrote, Hamas will continue to use the basements in Gaza's hospitals as the command posts of its vast terror tunnel network. It will continue to use mosques as fortified military outposts and weapons depots. He said it will continue to steal depots. He said it will continue depots. It will continue to steal fuel and humanitarian assistance from United Nations facilities. He wrote, while Israel is doing everything to get Palestinian civilians out of harm's way, Hamas is doing everything to keep Palestinian civilians in harm's way. Now, we saw an interview last night on the ABC where Israel's former Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, said that many of those that we think or that Hamas calls innocent civilians actually aren't innocent at all. He says that they're terrorists. And in fact, contrary to reports, he said that there were no civilians killed during Israel's strike at the Hamas base underneath the Jabalian refugee camp in northern Gaza. Have a look.
As I just mentioned, the Israeli army last night struck the Jabalia refugee camp, claiming to kill a senior Hamas commander involved in the attacks on Israel. But the strike also killed dozens of civilians. Does Israel make a calculation as to how many innocents it's prepared to kill to take out one Hamas commander?
First of all, I'm not certain that so many innocent civilians were killed yesterday. It was headquarters of Hamas, and everyone present there was part of Hamas and the fighting group of Hamas. They were killed, but they were not innocent civilians to start with.
But apparently Albanese knows more than Ehud Olmert, because today Albanese said that the images of that terrorist camp being bombed were cause for enormous concern.
Israel needs to recognise that in the way that it conducts itself, because the images that have been seen of the refugee camp, quite rightly, will cause enormous concern around the world.
Do you believe Israel has already overstepped the mark?
I think that every effort has to be made to ensure that innocent civilians are protected to every extent possible. The civilian toll is quite rightly causing enormous concern around the world. People are quite rightly traumatised. I met with people yesterday afternoon who have lost family members in Gaza. They are quite right to be traumatised and want their government to speak up for them, just as their government has spoken up for the loss of Israeli life.
That's our Prime Minister. Albanese there lecturing Israel again, offering it unsolicited military advice. He's also taking Hamas's word that civilians were killed, whereas Israel says that it was a targeted strike on the Hamas headquarters and it's unaware if any civilians were injured. As Olmert said, there weren't. Now, Olmert also said there's a trap here where Hamas, and I'd then add politicians like Albanese and Penny Wong and media like the ABC, describe people as innocent civilians when many of them are killers. When the host Sarah Ferguson put to Olmert last night that there were a high number of civilian casualties, he completely rejected the claim. Look at this quite stunning interaction where Olmert questions that narrative that there's a high number of civilian casualties. He says it's false.
It's been obvious that there have been very high civilian casualties in Gaza. Let me ask you a question about your own time as Prime Minister. Did you make calculations like this when you were...
Miss Ferguson,
yes.
Miss Ferguson, if I may say, it's not, nothing is obvious. You don't know, obviously, in Sydney, or anyone even here knows the exact and accurate number of casualties among civilians. They make an announcement. Sometimes they know the number of people killed even before they uncover the ruins behind them. So, we have to be very careful. I believe that there are innocent casualties, and I regret every one of them. But let's not be a little bit to get away with the inflated and unrealistic numbers.
Remember, Olmert is no friend of Netanyahu. But Albanese seems to be swallowing the Hamas line about how many civilians have died, figures that both the United States administration and Israel say are exaggerated, inflated, or completely wrong. All right, let's have a look at some of the other top stories today. Treasurer Jim Chalmers set out his net zero priorities at a conference, calling it a defining policy for his government.
I really believe that the net zero transformation will be the defining piece of the defining decade. And whether we succeed or fail in these turbulent 20s will in large part be determined by how we maximise our advantages and leverage our strengths when it comes to energy in our economy. That's why it's such a major focus of our government.
He insisted a shift to renewables will help curb inflation driven by coal, gas and oil costs. But the Australian Simon Benson warns that spending money to get out of inflation should not be the government's plan, calling it economically irresponsible. Let's bring in now Sky News host Danica DiGiorgio. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
This plan that the Treasurer outlined today is already controversial. It's hit some resistance from the opposition.
It has. The opposition's calling it completely reckless, saying that the government doesn't actually have a plan. I'll take you through some of the key points of it. I would call it ambitious, to be honest. I know you called it controversial, but essentially it's going to rely on private industries to be able to achieve this very ambitious target of net zero by 2050. So today we heard from the Treasurer. He's come out and he's saying we need big, bold public spending in order to get there. He's calling this uniquely Australian. He said, we're not following a US model. This is the unique Australian. But, Sharri, it's about $225 billion worth of investment. And that, I think, is the more interesting side to this. Investors have already come out and they've said, well, we need more clarity. How is Australia going to make this transition? But also, how can we keep Australia competitive already in a global environment? So the government's going to have to come out and prove now, in the short term, how will this not actually drive up prices, but also how it plans to achieve such an ambitious target in a way that doesn't already hurt consumers who are, of course, already hurting.
Now, another massive story today. We saw that just this morning, a sensational arrest. Victoria Police arrested Erin Patterson. She's the woman who cooked that infamous mushroom meal that saw 3 people die, a 4th be sent to hospital. What do we know about the details? Keeping in mind she hasn't been charged yet, just arrested.
Yeah, she hasn't been charged yet, has always maintained her innocence. But a huge development today. Erin Patterson has been arrested over that deadly mushroom lunch where she cooked a beef Wellington. She invited 4 guests over to her house, 2 of whom were her former in-laws. 3 died, as you mentioned. Now, today, police arrested her. They've searched her home. They're also using special sniffer dogs, a type of sniffer dog that can detect things, I guess, on this property. Interesting, police today, when they did their press conference, Sharri, they did not take any questions. They came out and gave a statement saying there's still a lot of unknowns. This is a very long, a very complex investigation with a lot of public interest. This is not just Australia-wide public interest. It's created news headlines as well overseas. But this is a significant development, given that this allegedly occurred back in July this year. We're now in November, and there has now been an arrest made.
We're going to come back to this story a bit later in the show. I've got a criminologist on to speak about it. But look, to another murder case, the school teacher Lilie James, we learned today that this was likely a premeditated murder, that the man suspected of killing her had bought a hammer on the morning and also leased a car.
Yeah, that's right. So Paul Thyssen, the man on our screen right now who allegedly murdered Lilie James, he did not have a car. He didn't own a car. And today we find out from the Daily Telegraph that he actually rented a car on the day that Lilie James was murdered. That is the car that he drove to the school. And I guess the theory is that he needed to get away. He needed to get out of that school as quickly as possible. That's why he rented the car. We also now know that in the week leading up to her alleged murder, he bought a hammer from a hardware store. Now, we don't know whether this was the alleged hammer used in the murder, but nonetheless, a hammer was bought. So we now know this wasn't a frenzied random attack. This was premeditated. He intended to go there that night. And sadly, Lilie James, one of several Australian women who have passed away this week.
Terrible story. Thank you so much for your time, Danica Di Giorgio.
Thanks, Sharri.
Now, after the break, I'll be joined by an Israeli politician, Sharon Haskell, also the criminologist coming up to speak about that deadly beef Wellington mushroom lunch. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, let's bring in now Israeli politician Sharon Haskell from Tel Aviv. Sharon, welcome back to the program. Look, we are seeing global calls for a ceasefire. Even Joe Biden seemed to join in these calls for a pause in Israel's war on terror today. What's the Knesset's view of these calls?
So we, first of all, we have to say, the Red Cross haven't even visited more than 240 hostages. Some of them are babies, some of them are elderly that need medication. Some of them are pregnant women. I mean, Hamas haven't even allowed the Red Cross to visit them to see whether they're okay, to give them medical treatment. I mean, when we say we need to pause, what does that pause mean? It means that our troops will be more in danger because they are already in Gaza. It means that Hamas have time to go and steal petrol from some humanitarian organization like they just did yesterday. They barged into one of the humanitarian aid compound, trying to steal food, medical equipment, and petrol from that compound. And so what is this ceasefire? How is this ceasefire is going to look? Israel is not going to be able to know whether it's more than 240 babies and elderly and women are okay. Israel is going to give time for Hamas to actually go and steal more petrol, more weapons, to set their soldiers in a better manner. I mean, how does that make any sense after such a horrific attack? Sharri, and it's important for me to maybe clarify that. Hamas is abusing Palestinians as much as they're abusing Israelis. They don't care for the lives of Palestinian children, just as much as they don't care for the life of Israeli children. And in our world, in the Middle East, if you look on the day after, our area, the Middle East, and the area in Israel, in Egypt, in Jordan, they're going to be safer without Hamas. Our society is going to be safer without Hamas. And that goes for Israelis and Palestinians as well.
Look, Sharon, we saw this horrible television address from a Hamas leader. It was on television in Lebanon. I don't know if you've seen it, but he says that he wants the annihilation of Israel, that they would commit the attacks of October 7 again and again and again. Do you think the world is taking seriously enough the threat, not just to Israel, but to the whole Western world that Hamas poses?
So some leaders really understand that, and they fully support us in completely eliminating Hamas. They understand that Hamas is no different than ISIS. It's not different than Al-Qaeda. And if the world is safer without Al-Qaeda, if society is safer without ISIS, our world is going to be safer without Hamas as well. And so the leaders who came here in support of the state of Israel, like Joe Biden and the German Chancellor and the Prime Minister of England and Macron from France, they understand that. And they understand that we have to join forces against radical Islam. That is not a conflict about a territorial area. And they know that. They have a lot of experience with different countries as well who had suffered in our region, in our borders as well. And so they are in full support of the state of Israel. They understand that fighting radical Islam will bring this area to a safer area, and they understand that the Palestinians are going to benefit from that as well. I mean, this Hamas leader who said he would commit that massacre again, that's the troops on the ground as well. They're saying the same things. If they get the opportunity, they'll commit the same massacre, the same rapes, the same beheading of babies. So you understand you cannot border such a devil terrorist organization. Sorry?
All right. No, I was just saying, no, I completely agree with you, Sharon Haskell. I really appreciate you joining us. You've been on the show a few times, and, you know, to hear that perspective coming from Israel is so important. Thank you very much for your time. Now, Victorian police raided the home of Erin Patterson this morning, 3 months after she cooked beef Wellington, a meal that's believed to have had poisonous mushrooms in it. It killed 3, sent another person to hospital. Erin's children were at the lunch, but they didn't fall ill. Erin was arrested today by homicide detectives. She strenuously denied any wrongdoing. She hasn't been charged. Joining me now is Xanthi Mallet, a forensic criminologist. Welcome to the program. What do we know so far about the arrest today? And I also want to ask you about that dumped mushroom hydrator in the rubbish tip and how crucial you think that'll be as a piece of evidence.
So what we know today is that the police have spent several hours at Erin Patterson's home looking for several items which seem to be targeted. They've got specific search dogs that are looking for IT items, so they may be SIM cards, etc., from phones. So the dogs have shown a lot of interest outside the property, so they obviously have some intelligence guiding what they're searching for. They've had 3 months to build up to this search, to plan this search, and at the same time they've been questioning Erin Patterson, really checking her story. They would have originally questioned her a number of months ago, but since then they've been building their case, building up the information that they have, and they will be running through a number of scenarios with her simultaneous to the search taking place. And in relation to that dehydrator, I've always felt that that is really the crux of this case. Erin Patterson says that she bought the mushrooms from an Asian supermarket, and that's how they ended up in the meal, those death cap mushrooms, and that's been confirmed that they were the toxic mushrooms in that beef Wellington. Yet we have this dehydrator that she dumped shortly after the individuals that attended that lunch fell ill. So the question is really, are there death cap mushroom spores in that dehydrator, and that's been sent abroad for testing? If there are, that indicates obviously that mushrooms have been there rather than having been bought from an Asian supermarket. The police are being very circumspect what they're releasing at the moment to the public, but that's really, for me, at the heart of this case.
Because I also just want to ask you about this other case, this other murder case in Sydney. School teacher Lilie James, we're learning today that her murder was likely premeditated, her suspected killer buying a hammer and leasing a car on the morning that she was killed. What does this tell us about how far in advance he might have planned this crime?
Well, as a hammer was bought in the days leading up to Lilie James's very sad and brutal murder, you have to wonder whether that was the intent in that kind of the week beforehand. So normally these situations are of the moment, they're situational as I would describe it, they're not necessarily planned. Yet as we have the purchase of a potential alleged weapon and we have the hiring of the car, and also the individual who is now deceased, who we believe is responsible for Lilie's murder, attended the school, he knew her habits, they dated for a number of weeks, he was a colleague at the school, he knew that she would have been there dropping off the polo equipment after the match that evening. So he knew where to find her, he knew she'd be alone, he had access. So it does appear that this was planned. And as soon as I became aware that he'd taken a hammer allegedly to that scene, that spoke to me of premeditation.
All right, Xanthi Mallet, thank you very much for your time. Still to come, Bronwyn Bishop and Jason Morrison will join me. We'll talk about why those flying in from Gaza need security checks. Stay tuned. A Jewish school in Melbourne, Bialik College, has hit back at TLMP Monique Ryan, who today posted this to her social media. She said, "We have no greater responsibility than protecting our children. As a paediatrician, I find the human suffering in Gaza intolerable." As you know, she sadly replaced Josh Frydenberg in the seat of Kooyong. Well, the principal of the Bialik College has hit back, writing a letter to her that says this: "Your use of the word intolerable is apt. The blindness of the apparently ethical to the suffering of one side is indeed intolerable, and something that I'm sure the hundreds of Jewish residents in your electorate and other like-minded Jewish citizens have noticed." It's an amazing letter. There'll be coverage of it in the Australian newspaper as well. Let's bring in now commentators Jason Morrison and Bronwyn Bishop. Bronwyn, how sad is it that you have someone who's barely posted anything about the terror attacks in Israel, but posts today about this one side?
The thing that appalls me, Sharri, is that I thought after the end of World War II that the hideousness of anti-Semitism was at an end. But it has been like a river that has flowed out of Germany, it flowed into Egypt and knocked the scab off. And what comes out is the pus of the sore of anti-Semitism. And that's what that letter is saying. It is showing absolutely no compassion at all or understanding of what is happening in this country, where she thinks it's fine to be making those sorts of statements. Monique Ryan, in the answer that the principal gave, she is showing that Monique Ryan has not even looked at the issues that count. She hasn't looked at what was done in that October raid with the murder of all those Jewish people, taking of 200 hostages. It just makes my spine go cold that there is just such blatant hatred that comes out of people like Monique Ryan, who tries to be a compassionate or
claims to be compassionate.
Yes, it clearly isn't.
Is it hatred or is it ignorance? So I actually think
hatred.
I think
she's not ignorant. She's a doctor.
Well, I actually think she's an idiot.
and the behaviour that she... This reminds me, you remember the Man Monis moment, the Lint Cafe? We had people who were, dead on the floor in the cafe, and there were idiots on Twitter going out to say, we have to urge to end Islamophobia. I'll ride with you. And we hadn't even had an end to the tragedy of that hideous terrorism attack in the heart of the biggest city in Australia, and there are people out there saying we've got to be careful about Islamophobia, not condemn the radical Islamist terrorists that committed the crime. This is the same sort of sickness where we want to be seen to be a part of some movement. And the idiot you're talking about, who replaced Josh Frydenberg, this is her moment of moral gesturing, to be able to show people that, she's a...
This is the side
I'm a
she's on.
doctor, I know, I'm better than you,
exactly.
I have a better insight.
Look, I want to ask you that Anthony Albanese has said that they're bringing home, or they want to bring home, 88 Australian citizens or residents or relatives of Australians who are have been living in Gaza. Bronwyn, what security concerns would you have about doing that until the agencies get in there and do a proper assessment?
Huge. I mean, I would have thought it was automatic. That if those people are going to be brought back to Australia, that they would be checked as an automatic response. No ifs, no buts, no maybes, because we have to be sure that we're not importing anyone who has an allegiance to Hamas.
Jason, also we saw on the streets of Bondi Beach just this afternoon some men ripping down posters that young Jewish women had posted of, some of them were of their family members who are being held hostage. And we're looking at the footage now, men ripping down those posters.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens to them. The police will investigate it. Will there be action? I doubt it. Will there be anything proportionate to the kind of ignorance that they're showing in doing all of this? But if it hadn't been filmed, it would have been written off as paranoia. Oh, you people are paranoid. You're paranoid that this is going on. It's being filmed and it's being shown, and we can see now who is behind it. And there is the ugly face of Jew haters. And that is it. And it's in the community. And, we see it in politicians. We also see it on Bondi Beach.
Yeah.
That's why it's hatred.
We saw, just on another topic, Treasurer Jim Chalmers outlined a plan to tackle inflation today, a green economy. What did you make of that, Bronwyn Bishop?
Honestly and truly, they have no idea, none at all. The one thing he could have not done was try and heavy the Reserve Bank by telling them they can't have a rise in interest rates, because he's now placed her in a position where she's more likely to do it, whereas common sense might have said can't, but she doesn't want to be seen to be heavied. I mean, the man flaps the lips, but nothing comes out. Nothing.
What did you think of this net zero plan? I mean, Simon Benson has questioned whether injecting that sort of money investment is the right way to tackle inflation.
The guys aren't fit for the game if he thinks that the solution is a target net zero. I mean, we are at the moment experiencing the lowest coal price in years. It dropped 20% yesterday. It dropped another 10% today. World coal prices are, I mean, coal is discounted. It should be the cheapest energy available. They're finding ways to make it not by adding, tariffs and indexed costs on top of it. That's the sort of stupidity that he's backing, and how you can be the treasurer for Australia with that mentality just tells me it's out of control. The ideology goes ahead of the need to protect people who are really struggling right now.
We're really starting to see people who kind of were letting it go by now starting to fight back. Farmers, people who seeing what it is doing to their lives.
Bronwyn, when you came in, we were speaking, just before we were on air, we were speaking about Albanese's comments today when he was asked about the war in Israel. What did you think of how he changed that question? He was asked specifically about anti-Semitism, and then he changed the answer to speak about Islamophobia.
The man, one of the reasons that Peter Dutton said, go to Israel, show that you mean what you say when you say you stand with America about the right of Israel to defend itself. He speaks out of the side of his mouth. There's no truth there. There's nothing you can believe that he says, and that's exactly what he did. When he goes off script, when he reads, somebody writes quite good speeches for him sometimes. He goes off script, and that's what you get.
Yeah, the old street urchin comes back again, and he can't help it. He's back to the old game again. Buck each way elbow. He's the I'll ride with you kind of, gesturing just to make sure he's a buck each way on everything.
Just plain old elbow the trot.
The trot. That's right.
All right, Bronwyn Bishop, Jason Morrison, thank you both so much. Still to come, Arab-Israeli activist Yoseph Haddad tells us what we need to know about Hamas that the media aren't speaking about. Stay tuned. All right, let's bring in now Arab-Israeli journalist Yoseph Haddad from Israel. Welcome to the program. Thanks for joining me. Now, you've written that Israel is facing a war on 5 fronts. Tell us about this.
Yes, of course. I mean, we've seen what's going on in the south of Israel when we're dealing with the terrorist organization ISIS Hamas. And I really hope people call Hamas as exactly what they are, ISIS Hamas. And then we have another area, which is the north, Hezbollah, and the Houthis from Yemen. And of course, we need to keep an eye on the West Bank because even there, Iran are trying to make a lot of problems. And this is what I'm talking about. Iran controlling all those areas very close to the borders, and Israel is being threatened. And the last war is for the misinformation about what's going on here. It starts from adopting the narrative of Hamas, the terrorist organization, towards misinformation about what really going on with the numbers of the civilians, of the terrorists who are dying in Gaza, and of course is what's going on within the territory of Israel. So those are the 5 wars that we are currently are facing.
Well, let's pick up on that last theme. Do you think the international media is disproportionately taking the Hamas narrative?
Can you hear me?
I can now. Yes, go ahead. Are you there, Yosef?
Can you hear me, please?
Yes, I can hear you. I was asking you about whether the foreign press is taking the Hamas narrative, the Hamas propaganda as truth. All right, I think we have lost the audio from Yoseph Haddad, but I think that is clearly what we're starting to see. We are seeing this equivalence that the media all around the world, including in Australia, is giving to Hamas and Israel. They think there's this equal footing, Israel says this on the one side, Hamas says this on the other side, when what we've seen is that this is propaganda coming out of a terrorist organisation. You can't give it equal weight to Israeli defence officials, to the Mossad, to the Prime Minister. Okay, let's bring you back in, Yosef. What do you think about this?
Well, the truth is that we are seeing that the world is adopting, some of the media world is adopting the narrative of Hamas. Specifically, if we are talking about BBC, we've seen that when the Islamic Jihad actually targeted Israel and one of the missiles failed and bombed the hospital in Gaza, we've seen also how fast the world adopted the numbers that Hamas gave to the world. 500 people were killed. And it's unbelievable because I don't understand how can you count 500 people within the first 10 minutes of what's going on. Here in Israel, 3 weeks after, and we're still counting bodies. And yes, we have 1,400 Israelis who were massacred by the terrorist organization ISIS Hamas, but we are still counting the bodies. And so the fact is that some of the mainstream international media news adopting that narrative so easily without even checking, it means that they are not a reliable source. It means that they are actually sharing a fake news. And this is something hurting Israelis, both Arabs and Jews in Israel, and of course Palestinian as well. Please, we have to look for the numbers. We have to look for the reality. Otherwise, we will keep spreading misinformation, which will harm all of us. And if I may add just specifically about what's going on within the Arabs in Israel, the Arab Israelis, it is very important to understand that the war is not between Arabs and Jews. The war is not between Israelis and Palestinians. The war is between Israel and between the barbaric terrorist organization ISIS Hamas. It's between the good and the bad. And you better be on the right side of the history with the good people. And the majority of the Israeli Arab society here absolutely condemn Hamas and never ever support that terrorist organization.
And that is why it is so important to hear from you, Yoseph Haddad, and I'm so grateful that you joined me tonight. I'm sorry we're out of time, but I'm going to have you back on the program as the war continues. Thank you very much. That's all we've got time for this week. Thanks so much for watching. It's been a tough week, of course. I'll see you 5 o'clock on Monday.